The shuttle descended through the purple clouds of Valoria Prime, and Daniel Carter pressed his face against the viewing window like a child seeing snow for the first time. But the wonder in his chest was mixed with a heavy sense of dread that he could not shake. No matter how hard he tried, he was 34 years old. A diplomat from Earth who had spent 10 years learning alien languages and customs. And now he was about to become the husband of a queen who had never even seen his face. A political arrangement designed by people far more powerful than him to secure an alliance that humanity desperately needed. The Valorian Empire controlled 17 star systems and possessed technology that made Earth look like it was still playing with stones and sticks. And when the Galactic Council suggested a marriage alliance to strengthen the bond between the two civilizations, the humans had no real choice but to agree. Ambassador Claire Morgan had chosen Daniel for this mission because he was patient and calm and willing to sacrifice his own happiness for the greater good of his species. And she had promised him that this would be remembered as one of the most important acts of service in human history. But as the shuttle landed on the golden platform of the royal palace, Daniel wondered if anyone would remember him at all. The palace doors opened, and a wave of cold air washed over him as he stepped onto Valorian soil for the first time. And the first thing he noticed was that nobody was smiling. Not the guards in their silver armor, not the servants in their flowing robes, not the nobles who had gathered to witness the arrival of their queen's new husband. High Advisor Torrin stood at the front of the welcoming party, a tall alien with pale blue skin and eyes that seemed to look right through Daniel as if he were made of glass. And when he spoke, his voice carried the tone of someone addressing a stray animal that had wandered into their home. "The human has arrived," Torrin announced to the crowd, not bothering to use Daniel's name. "Her Majesty will receive him when she has time." Daniel bowed respectfully, the way he had been taught, and said nothing because he knew that his words would not matter to these people. Not yet. Not until he proved that he was more than the primitive creature they believed him to be. They led him through corridors made of crystal and light, past paintings of ancient Valorian rulers who stared down at him with expressions of eternal judgment. And finally they brought him to a chamber that was beautiful but cold, located in a distant wing of the palace far from the royal quarters. "These will be your rooms," a servant told him without meeting his eyes. "You will be summoned when the queen wishes to see you." Daniel thanked her politely. And when the door closed behind him, he stood alone in the silence and allowed himself one moment of doubt before pushing it aside and beginning to unpack his belongings. 3 days passed before Queen Seraphine finally called for him. She sat on a throne carved from a single piece of black crystal, her silver hair flowing down her shoulders like liquid moonlight, and her violet eyes studied Daniel with the kind of attention one might give to an insect crawling across a dinner plate. "So you are the human?" she said, a voice echoing through the vast throne room where dozens of nobles had gathered to watch this meeting. "I expected something more impressive." Daniel bowed deeply and replied, "I hope to exceed your expectations in time, Your Majesty." A ripple of laughter spread through the court, and Seraphine allowed herself a small smile that held no warmth at all. "My advisors tell me that humans are resilient," she continued, "that your species has survived despite coming from a death world filled with predators and disasters. But looking at you now, I find that difficult to believe. We have learned to hide our strength." "Your Majesty," Daniel said calmly, "it is how we survived." Seraphine leaned forward on her throne, and for a moment something flickered in her eyes that might have been curiosity, but it vanished as quickly as it appeared. "You will have a role here," she declared. "You will attend ceremonies and stand beside me when the diplomats require proof of our alliance. But you will not speak in council meetings. You will not interfere in matters of state. And you will not forget that you are here because of politics, not because you belong." Daniel absorbed these words without flinching and simply nodded his acceptance. "You may go," the queen said, already turning her attention to other matters. "Torin will inform you of your duties." As Daniel walked out of the throne room, he felt the eyes of every noble burning into his back, and he heard their whispers following him like shadows. Words like primitive and pet and temporary arrangement floating through the air that night. Alone in his chambers, Daniel sat at a small desk and began writing in a journal he had brought from Earth, recording everything he had observed about Valorian customs, military strength, political relationships, and the subtle tensions he had noticed between different factions of the court. He wrote until his hand ached, and when he finally set down his pen, he looked out the window at the 3 moons of Valoria Prime and made a silent promise to himself. They believed he was nothing, a decoration, a symbol without substance. But Daniel Carter had not survived 34 years on a death world by giving up when things seemed impossible. He would learn their language perfectly. He would study their history until he knew it better than they did. He would watch and wait and prepare for the moment when he could prove that humanity was not the weak and primitive species they believed that the Tibetan Queen had given him a role. But Daniel intended to write his own story, and so he began his life as the unwanted husband, invisible to everyone around him, dismissed by the woman he had married, mocked by the court that should have welcomed him, but never broken, never defeated, and never willing to accept that this was all he could ever be. In the days that followed, Daniel became a ghost in his own palace, present but unseen, silent but always listening. And the Valorians quickly forgot that he was there at all, which was exactly what he wanted them to do. 6 months had passed since Daniel Carter arrived on Valoria Prime, and in that time he had become so invisible that servants sometimes walked right past him without noticing he was there, which suited his purposes perfectly. Every morning he woke before dawn and made his way to the palace archives, a vast library filled with thousands of years of Valorian history, military records, and political documents that nobody thought to protect from a human who was considered too primitive to understand them. He read everything he could find, teaching himself the complex written language of the Valorians until he could read faster than most of the scholars who worked there. And he filled notebook after notebook with observations and analysis that he kept hidden in a secret compartment beneath his bed. The palace guards had grown accustomed to seeing him wandering the halls at odd hours, and they had stopped paying attention to where he went or what he did, which allowed him to discover parts of the palace that even some nobles had never seen. It was during one of these late-night explorations that he met Myra Voss, a human woman who worked as a servant in the royal kitchens, one of the handful of humans who had been brought to Valoria Prime as part of the cultural exchange program. "You should not be down here," she whispered when she found him studying a map of the palace's underground tunnels. "If Torin catches you, he will make your life even more difficult than it already is." Daniel smiled and replied, "I did not know my life could get more difficult." Myra laughed softly and then grew serious, her eyes darting around to make sure they were alone before she spoke again. "There is talk among the servants," she said quietly. "The other species on the council are worried about the Kethrani Dominion. They say war is coming, and some of the nobles here are not happy about the alliance with Earth." Daniel leaned closer and asked, "What kind of talk?" "Dangerous talk," Myra answered. "I have heard High Advisor Torin speaking with visitors late at night. Aliens I do not recognize. And the things they say make me afraid." This information confirmed what Daniel had already suspected, that someone in the Valorian court was working against the Queen. And he thanked Myra for her courage and asked her to keep listening and report anything else she heard. Meanwhile, the Kethrani Dominion had begun launching raids against the outer colonies of the Valorian Empire, burning settlements and capturing prisoners. And Queen Seraphine held war councils every day to discuss the growing threat. Daniel was never invited to these meetings. He would stand outside the council chamber doors, listening to the muffled voices within. And later he would piece together what had been discussed by talking to servants and reading the reports that careless officials left lying on their desks through his diplomatic channels on Earth. Daniel gathered his own intelligence about the Kethrani, learning their tactics, their weaknesses, and their patterns of attack, and he compiled this information into a detailed report that he hoped might be useful one evening. He finally gathered the courage to approach Queen Seraphine directly. She was walking through the palace gardens with her attendants when Daniel stepped into her path and bowed respectfully, holding out the folder containing his analysis. "Your Majesty," he said, "I have information about the Kethrani that may help with your war preparations." Intelligence gathered through human diplomatic networks. Seraphine stopped and stared at him as if she had forgotten he existed. And then her expression hardened into something cold and dismissive. "You have been reading about military matters?" she asked, her voice dripping with contempt. "How amusing. I only wish to help," Daniel replied, keeping his voice calm and respectful. "There are things in this report that your advisors may not know." The Queen took the folder from his hands, glanced at the first page, and then handed it to one of her attendants without reading further. "Your species barely left your cradle world," she said, her violet eyes boring into his. "What could you possibly understand about interstellar warfare? Stick to your ceremonies and your silence, human, and leave the real work to those who are capable of it." She walked past him without another word, and her attendants followed, leaving Daniel standing alone in the garden with nothing to show for his months of work. But he did not give up. Instead, he found the palace guard training grounds and asked the captain if he could observe their practice sessions. Explaining that he was curious about Valorian fighting techniques, the captain, a grizzled veteran named Korath, who had lost an arm in some ancient war, looked at Daniel with something closer to respect than any other Valorian had shown him. "You want to learn to fight?" Korath asked, his voice rough but not unkind. "Most nobles run from the training grounds. I am not most nobles." Daniel replied. Korath studied him for a long moment and then nodded slowly. "Very well, humans, show me what you can do." What followed was weeks of brutal training, sessions that pushed Daniel's body to its limits and beyond. But he refused to quit no matter how many times he was knocked down or how badly his muscles screamed for rest. Guards who had once laughed at him began to watch with growing surprise as this human refused to break, kept getting up no matter how hard he fell, and slowly started to hold his own against warriors twice his size. Humans are strange creatures, Korath admitted one evening after Daniel had finally managed to disarm him in a sparring match. "You have no claws, no armor, no natural weapons. But you simply refuse to stop fighting. It is how we survived our world," Daniel said, breathing hard but standing tall. "We learned that giving up means death." That night, the alarms began to scream across Valoria Prime. The Kethrani had launched a full invasion, and their warships were breaking through the orbital defenses while the main Valorian fleet was stationed 3 systems away, exactly where someone had told them to be. Chaos erupted throughout the palace, and servants ran screaming through the corridors. Daniel Carter realized that everything he had prepared for was about to be put to the test. The sky above Valoria Prime burned orange and red as Kethrani warships descended through the atmosphere, their weapons tearing holes in the ancient city that had stood for 10,000 years. And the screams of the dying mixed with the thunder of explosions that shook the palace to its foundations. Daniel ran through the corridors searching for anyone who could tell him what was happening. But the halls were filled with panicked servants and guards rushing in every direction without any clear purpose or command. He found Myra hiding in the kitchens with a group of terrified workers. And he grabbed her arm and pulled her toward the servant passages that he had memorized during his months of exploration. "We need to get to the emergency bunkers," he shouted over the noise. "Do you know where the Queen is?" Mira shook her head and replied, "The last I heard, she was in the throne room when the attack began." But then the explosion started and everyone scattered. Daniel's heart sank because he knew that the throne room was one of the most exposed parts of the palace. But before he could decide what to do, a massive blast ripped through the ceiling above them, and they barely managed to dive out of the way as burning debris crashed down where they had been standing. They ran through smoke-filled passages until they reached a junction where Captain Korath stood with a handful of wounded guards, his armor scorched and his face covered in blood from a gash on his forehead. "The defense grid is down," Korath reported grimly when he saw Daniel. "Someone sabotaged it from inside the palace. The shields fell just as the Kethrani fleet arrived. This was planned from the beginning. Where is the Queen?" Daniel Demandakorath's expression darkened as he answered. "High Advisor Torin led her to what he called a safe room. But I have just received word that Kethrani soldiers are already in that section of the palace. I think he delivered her directly to them." Daniel felt a cold fury building in his chest. The same fury that had kept humans alive through ice ages and predators and every disaster their death world had thrown at them. And he made a decision without hesitation. "Show me how to get there," he said. "I am going after her." Korath stared at him for a moment and then nodded with something like respect. "I will come with you. We both know this is probably a suicide mission." "Humans do not believe in suicide missions," Daniel replied. "We believe in missions that other species would call impossible." They gathered what weapons they could find. Plasma pistols and combat knives and one heavy rifle that Korath handed to Daniel with a warning that it would burn through its power cell in less than 50 shots. The path to the safe room led through corridors filled with Kethrani soldiers, towering reptilian warriors covered in black armor who fought with savage efficiency and showed no mercy to anyone they encountered. Daniel and Korath moved through the shadows, using the maintenance tunnels that Daniel had mapped during his lonely explorations, and they emerged behind enemy lines without being detected. They found the safe room surrounded by a dozen Kethrani guards, and through a cracked door, Daniel could see Queen Seraphine bound to a chair while Torin stood before her, explaining how the Kethrani had promised him control of the Empire in exchange for his betrayal. "You fool," Seraphine spat at her former advisor. "They will kill you the moment you stop being useful." Torin laughed and replied, "Perhaps, but at least I will have the satisfaction of watching them execute you first. You and your pathetic human husband, who thought he could play politics with real powers." Daniel looked at Korath and held up 3 fingers, counting down silently before they burst through the door with weapons. Blazing, the first 3 guards fell before anyone realized what was happening. And Daniel moved through the chaos with a speed and ferocity that shocked even Korath, who had trained with him for weeks but had never seen a human truly fighting for survival. Daniel shot 2 more guards, and then his rifle ran dry. So he drew his combat knife and threw himself at the nearest Kethrani, ducking under its claws and driving the blade into a gap in its armor. Blood sprayed across his face, but he did not stop. Could not stop, because stopping meant death for himself and the woman he had sworn to protect. Korath took down the remaining guards while Daniel charged toward Torin, who was trying to flee through a back passage. And Daniel caught him by the throat and slammed him against the wall with strength that seemed impossible for such a small creature. "You sold out your own people," Daniel growled, his voice barely recognizable. "You condemned millions to death for your own ambition." Torin tried to speak, but Daniel's grip was too tight, and the traitor's eyes bulged with terror as he realized that this human he had dismissed as worthless was about to end his life. "Daniel!" Korath shouted. More are coming, we need to move now. Daniel released Torin, letting him fall unconscious to the floor, and ran to free Seraphine from her bonds, while Karth covered the door. Queen looked at him with an expression he could not read. Shock and confusion, and something else that might have been shame. But there was no time for words as more Kethrani soldiers poured into the corridor outside. There is another way out, Daniel said, pulling Seraphine toward a ventilation shaft that he knew led to the lower levels. Stay behind me. They crawled through darkness while the sounds of battle raged above them. And twice they had to stop and wait in silence as Kethrani patrols passed nearby. But Daniel's knowledge of the palace layout saved them from detection. They emerged in the palace gardens just as a Kethrani commander found them. A massive warrior who towered over Daniel and raised his weapon to execute the Queen. Daniel threw himself between them. The plasma blast hit him in the shoulder, and he screamed as fire tore through his flesh. But even as he fell, he managed to draw his knife and drive it into the commander's throat, killing the alien before his own body hit the ground. The last thing he saw before darkness claimed him was Queen Seraphine kneeling over him, her violet eyes wide with an emotion he had never seen from her before, and her voice calling his name as if it mattered, as if he mattered, as if he had always mattered, and she was only now realizing it when Valorian reinforcements finally arrived. They found their queen covered in blood, cradling the unconscious body of the human husband she had spent 6 months treating like he was nothing, and they found 17 dead Kethrani soldiers scattered around them, killed by a single primitive human who had refused to let his wife die. Daniel woke in darkness, his shoulder burning with a pain that seemed to reach all the way down to his bones. And for a moment, he did not know where he was or how he had gotten there. Then the memories came flooding back. The invasion, the rescue, the plasma blast that should have killed him. And he tried to sit up, but his body refused to cooperate. "Do not move," a voice said beside him. And he turned his head to see Queen Seraphine sitting in a chair next to his medical bed, her silver hair disheveled and dark circles under her violet eyes, as if she had not slept in days. "The doctors say you should have died. The plasma burned through muscle and bone. But somehow your body is healing faster than they thought possible." Daniel tried to speak, but his throat was dry. And Seraphine reached for a cup of water and helped him drink before he could even ask, "How long?" He managed to croak, "5 days." She replied. "We evacuated to the outer provinces while the Kethrani consolidated their hold on the capital. Torin is dead. He tried to escape custody, and one of my guards decided that was unacceptable." Daniel nodded weakly and asked, "What happens now?" Seraphine was quiet for a long moment, and when she spoke her voice was different than he had ever heard it. Softer and filled with something that might have been regret. "I have spent 6 months treating you like you were nothing," she said slowly. "I told myself that humans were primitive, that your species had nothing to offer, that you were a political inconvenience I had to tolerate. But I was wrong." She stood and walked to the window, looking out at the gray sky of whatever world they had fled to, and her shoulders seemed to carry a weight that had not been there before. 17 soldiers, she continued. 17 Kethrani warriors, each one trained from birth to kill. And you defeated them all while bleeding from a wound that should have been fatal. My own guards could not have done what you did. Daniel struggled to push himself into a sitting position, ignoring the fire in his shoulder, and he looked at the Queen with eyes that held no anger or resentment. "I did not do it to prove anything," he said quietly. "I did it because it was the right thing to do. Because you are my wife, and I made a promise to protect you, even if you did not want my protection." Seraphine turned to face him, and for the first time he saw tears glistening in her alien eyes. "How can you not hate me?" she asked, her voice breaking. "After everything I said, everything I did, how can you still call me your wife?" Daniel smiled despite the pain and replied, "Because I understand." Your people are proud and powerful, and you have never needed anyone's help before. Accepting a human as an equal must feel like admitting weakness. But it is not weakness to have allies, it is strength. The queen stood there in silence. And then she did something that shocked Daniel more than any battle ever could. She knelt beside his bed and took his hand in hers, her cool blue fingers wrapping around his warm human skin. And she bowed her head in a gesture of respect that he knew meant more in Valorian culture than any words could express. The military commanders want to surrender, she said without raising her head. They say the Kethrani are too strong, that fighting back will only lead to more death. But I cannot accept that. I will not accept that. Daniel squeezed her hand and said, "Then we fight over the next few days." As his body healed with a speed that continued to amaze the Valorian doctors, Daniel worked with Seraphine to develop a counterattack strategy based on everything he had learned during his months of secret study. Military commanders were skeptical at first. These proud Valorian warriors who had spent centuries believing that no other species could teach them anything about war. But Seraphine stood beside Daniel and demanded that they listen. "The Kethrani think they have won," Daniel explained, pointing to a holographic map of Valoria Prime. "They believe the war is over, and they are already fighting among themselves over territory and resources. That is when they are most vulnerable." He outlined a plan that used human military tactics, strategies born from centuries of fighting against impossible odds on a world that tried to kill them every day, combined with Valorian technology and the element of surprise. The shield generators on their command ship can be disabled from the ground, he continued. There is a maintenance access point in the old industrial district that they do not know about because it was not in any of the records Torin gave them. If we can get a strike team inside, we can bring down their shields and the fleet can destroy their command structure. Captain Korath, who had barely left Daniel's side since the rescue, stepped forward and declared, "I will lead the strike team." Daniel shook his head and replied, "No, I will lead it. This plan only works if we move fast and quiet. And I know those tunnels better than anyone. You are still recovering from wounds that should have killed you." One of the commanders protested. "This is madness." "Perhaps," Daniel agreed. "But humans have a long history of doing impossible things when people tell us we cannot." The room fell silent, and all eyes turned to Queen Seraphine, who looked at her human husband with an expression of wonder and pride that she had never shown before. "The human leads the strike team," she announced in a voice that allowed no argument. "And I want volunteers from the Earth Embassy to join him." It is time the galaxy saw what humanity is truly capable of, as the commanders filed out to begin preparations. Seraphine caught Daniel's arm and pulled him aside, her violet eyes searching his face for something she seemed afraid to find. "Come back to me," she whispered. "Please, Daniel, come back." He cupped her face in his hands. This beautiful alien queen who had finally seen him for who he really was. And he kissed her forehead gently before stepping back. "I will come back," he promised. "And when I do, we will rebuild everything they destroyed. Together, the final battle for Valoria Prime was about to begin." The dropship screamed through the atmosphere of Valoria Prime, shaking violently as anti-aircraft fire exploded all around them, and Daniel gripped his weapon tightly while the 20 soldiers under his command waited in grim silence for the landing. Half of them were Valorian warriors who had volunteered for this suicide mission, and half were humans from the Earth Embassy who had refused to let Daniel face this battle without his own kind beside him. A young human named Kyle Bennett sat across from Daniel, checking his rifle for the 10th time, and when their eyes met, the younger man smiled nervously and said, "My grandfather used to tell me stories about human soldiers fighting against impossible odds. I never thought I would be living one of those stories myself." Daniel clapped him on the shoulder and replied, "Today we write a new story, one that The galaxy will remember forever. The ship hit the ground hard and the rear doors burst open. And Daniel was the first one out, leading his team into the burning ruins of what had once been the most beautiful city in 17 star systems. Streets were filled with rubble and the bodies of those who had not escaped the initial invasion. And Daniel felt a cold rage building in his chest as he led his team through the destruction toward their target. The industrial district was 3 kilometers away, and they had to move fast because the Valorian fleet was already in position. Waiting for the signal that the shields were down, they encountered their first Kethrani patrol within minutes. 6 warriors guarding a checkpoint, and Daniel gave the signal for his team to spread out and flank them before opening fire. The battle was brief and brutal. And when it was over, Daniel had lost 2 Valorians, but all 6 Kethrani lay dead in the street. They kept moving, fighting through 3 more patrols before reaching the entrance to the maintenance tunnels. And by then their team had been reduced to 14 soldiers. Wounded and exhausted, but still determined to complete their mission. The tunnels were dark and narrow, and Daniel led the way using memory alone, his feet carrying him through passages he had explored 100 times during his lonely months as Beat. Carrying him through passages he had explored 100 times during his lonely months as Voorhees, carrying his lonely months as Basfidi. The invisible consort, they emerged beneath the Kethrani command ship, a massive vessel that had landed in the central plaza and now served as the headquarters for the occupation force. And Daniel could see the shield generator pulsing with blue light just 50 meters away. "There are at least 30 guards," Kyle whispered, pointing to the Kethrani soldiers patrolling the perimeter. "We cannot fight through that many." Daniel studied the situation and then turned to his team with a plan that was either brilliant or insane. "We split up," he said. "Half of you create a diversion on the east side. Draw as many guards as you can. The rest come with me to the generator." Captain Korath, who had insisted on joining the mission despite his own wounds, nodded and said, "I will lead the diversion team. Give us 5 minutes and then move." The Valorian warrior clasped Daniel's arm in the traditional gesture of respect between soldiers. And then he was gone, leading 7 fighters toward their positions while Daniel waited in the shadows with the remaining 6. The explosion that followed was massive, a fuel depot that Korath had rigged to blow, and suddenly the night was filled with fire and screaming Kethrani as guards rushed toward the source of the chaos. "Now!" Daniel shouted, and his team burst from cover and sprinted toward the generator. They were halfway there when a massive figure stepped out of the shadows. A Kethrani commander even larger than the one Daniel had killed during the rescue, wearing ceremonial armor. That marked him as someone of great importance. The human. The commander growled, his reptilian eyes burning with hatred. "I have heard stories about you, the pet who thinks he is a warrior." Daniel's team raised their weapons, but the commander was faster, cutting down 2 of them with his plasma blade. Before anyone could fire, "Go!" Daniel screamed at the survivors. "Get to the generator. I will handle him." Kyle hesitated, but Daniel shoved him toward the target, and then he turned to face the Kethrani commander alone. Fight that followed was the most brutal of Daniel's life. The commander was stronger and faster and better trained. And within seconds, Daniel was bleeding from a dozen cuts, his armor torn, and his body screaming for rest that he could not afford. But humans had not survived the death world by being stronger or faster. They had survived by refusing to die. Daniel took every blow and kept coming. Kept fighting. Kept searching for an opening that would let him end this battle. And when the commander finally made a mistake, overextending on a killing strike, Daniel was ready. He ducked under the blade and drove his combat knife into the gap between the commander's helmet and armor, twisting the blade as the massive alien staggered and fell. And Daniel collapsed on top of his enemy as the light faded from those reptilian eyes. Through blurring vision, he saw Kyle and the others reaching the generator, saw the explosion of sparks as they destroyed the control systems. And then the blue shield around the command ship flickered and died above him. The sky lit up as the Valorian fleet opened fire. The command ship exploded in a pillar of flame that rose a kilometer into the air. And across the planet, the Kethrani forces fell into chaos as their leadership was destroyed in a single devastating strike. Daniel lay in the rubble, too wounded to move, too tired to care if he lived or died, and he watched the Valorian ships descending through the smoke like angels of vengeance. Hours later, he woke to find himself being carried through the streets of the liberated capital, and the faces looking down at him were not filled with contempt or dismissal, but with awe and respect. Queen Seraphine was waiting in the central plaza where the galactic news feeds had gathered to broadcast the liberation of Valoria Prime. And when she saw Daniel, she ran to him without any regard for royal dignity. "You came back," she whispered, her voice breaking with emotion. "You promised and you came back." Daniel smiled weakly and replied, "I keep my promises." The queen turned to face the cameras and the assembled crowds, and her voice rang out across the plaza and across 1,000 worlds that were watching this moment. "This man is Daniel Carter of Earth," she declared. "He is my husband, my partner, and from this day forward, he shall be known as the champion of Valoria, for he stood alone against an empire, and he conquered." She offered her hand to help him rise, but Daniel shook his head and climbed to his feet on his own, standing tall despite his wounds, because he wanted the galaxy to see that humanity would never stay down, no matter how many times they were knocked down. "I did not do this for a title," he said, his voice carrying across the silent plaza. "I did it because it was right. Because that is what humans do." Seraphine looked at him with love and pride burning in her violet eyes, and she said, "Then let the galaxy remember this day, and let them never again underestimate the species that came from Earth." The crowds erupted in cheers that echoed across the stars, and Daniel Carter stood beside his queen as an equal at last, no longer invisible, no longer dismissed, no longer the unwanted husband. He was the human who had refused to break, and his story would be told for 1,000 generations.